Thank you. Yeah, so this afternoon, the honor falls on me to moderate the session. And for this afternoon, the focus is on the sustainability challenge. So we move away a bit from the working with EASA sessions that we had this morning, and we now focus on sustainability. And so the first part of the afternoon, we have two sessions. So the first one will be on the EASA activities on the sustainability, and Dietmar and Steve will come and tell you a bit more about that in a minute. And then that will be followed by the panel for going electrical and hybrid. So as I say, it's two sessions, so we'll have Steve and Dietmar presenting, followed by questions for Steve and Dietmar. So please feel free to use Slido to enter your questions as this morning. And then we will have a change of those on stage and invite up the panel on electrical hybrid propulsion systems. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Steve Arrowsmith and Dietmar Blumen to come and talk to you about EASA activities on sustainability.
Thanks. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the green-tinged part of the agenda where we step into the sort of sustainability area from an EASA's remit. My name is Steve Arrowsmith. I'm the chief expert on environmental protection within EASA, and I'm here with Dietmar Blumen, who's the Sustainable Aviation Program Manager, to give you a bit of an insight into our sustainability activities. So the coordination across the agency in terms of sustainability is done within the Sustainable Aviation Program. We're going to give you a bit of insight in terms of what that contains within this presentation, and then dive into a bit more detail with regard to some of the latest development, which is linked to the recent signing of the Refuel EU Aviation Initiative that's there to incentivize sustainable aviation fuels. That was just signed last week, and we'll provide a bit more detail on that. So as you know, EASA's it's its 20th anniversary this year, and so we thought it may be a good way of trying to explain the Sustainability Aviation Program by looking back over the last 20 years with regard to how our environmental activities have evolved with the changing climate within the aviation sector. So that should hopefully tell a bit of a story, a bit of a narrative with regard to our environmental remit, and there's a lot of parallels with the wider aviation sector, which you'll no doubt see. So starting right from the beginning, in 2003, we were very much focused on our certification work, certifying products against the environmental standards, which initially were directly referenced in our basic regulation, and these were the ICAO Annex 16 standards. Volume 1 covers aircraft noise, and Volume 2 covers engine emissions. And since 2003, we have certified now over 30,000 different aircraft configurations against the aircraft noise requirements, and over 800 engine configurations against the emission requirements. So significant work since the agency began in this area. As well as the certification work, we recognized as the agency evolved that we also needed to get a better understanding in terms of what's the environmental impacts from an aviation perspective. And so we started to get involved in the modeling side of things in 2007. In the work we were doing with an ICAO, we found that the noise model they were using there to actually assess the noise impact within the European region was actually underestimating it by 40%. So we worked with the European Commission to develop a new noise model called STAPIS that looks at the European region and provides a much more accurate picture as to what's going on. At the present moment, it has over 100 major airports within Europe, and we use this tool to assess regulatory proposals, policy proposals, both at ICAO level and within Europe. In 2008, we started getting into the research side of things, and that has evolved over time. We're involved in all sorts of research projects. But in 2008, we initiated a research project called Sample that started looking at the potential for particulate matter engine emission standards. And we'll come back to that 10 years later. You'll see that later in the presentation. But research is certainly a key component within the program, within EASA. And then in 2009, again, on the modeling side, we took over a model called AeroMS, which is the European state-of-the-art market-based measure model. And this model has been used to assess the impacts of policies with regard to the EU emissions trading scheme within Europe, but also the ICAO CORSIA scheme, this carbon offsetting and reduction scheme. And this tool is important from the perspective of looking at policy options beyond what may be possible in terms of in-sector measures, so technology, operations, fuels. This looks at market-based measures, so out-of-sector measures. In 2010, building on our work in terms of actually certifying the products, we are also very much involved in terms of standard setting. So maintaining the standards, the regulatory limits with regard to the environmental standards. And in 2010, we came an EASA-led process at ICAO, finally agreed on a new engine emission standard for NOx, which looked to address not just local air quality, but also climate change. So standard setting, again, a key component of our program. And similarly in 2013, building on reviewing the standards on a regular basis, we agreed a new aircraft noise standard, referred to as Chapter 14 for subsonic aircraft, utilizing the STAPIS noise model that we developed, first of all to justify that we actually did need to review the standard, and then to actually agree on what the revised noise limits should be, taking into account what's technologically feasible, economically reasonable, and environmentally beneficial. In 2014, we got a new remit handed to us in the form of the noise regulation, which implements within Europe the ICAO, what they call a balanced approach to noise management around airports, so looking at reduction of noise at source, operations, land use planning, operating restrictions. And within this regulation, EASA was asked to validate aircraft noise and performance data that is then used within models to calculate noise contours around airports in Europe, and then informs the subsequent noise action plans to mitigate noise around airports. And to also manage what we call an aircraft noise certificate database. So all airlines operating into Europe have to supply their noise certificate into this database, and we then facilitate the provision of that data to the airports they're operating to, so making it more efficient in terms of that exchange of information. And we currently have over 10,000 certificates in that database that captures the configuration of the aircraft and its associated noise levels. In the subsequent period, for 2016 and 2017, again, we got really back into the kind of standard setting mode. And there were some deliverables there that were quite key at the ICAO level. First of all, in 2016, there was an agreement on a new Annex 16 Volume 3, which covers aeroplane CO2 emissions, looking to prioritize fuel efficiency within the aircraft design process. And then in 2017, Volume 4 within Annex 16, which agreed on a market-based measure at the global level, this carbon offsetting and reduction scheme, to try and limit emissions and ensure that they don't go above 2019 levels. And so that was a key moment in terms of pulling together various standards from a CO2 emissions perspective, recognizing that was considered to be a political priority at the time. In 2016, it's also worth mentioning that we published our first European Aviation Environmental Report with the aim of providing objective, robust and credible information as to the environmental performance of the aviation sector and the trends over time to inform discussions on what's required. A key milestone in 2018 was the update to the basic regulation. And at that point, there was a recognition that the environmental topic was becoming a much more high-profile priority. Our remit needed to be expanded. And so within that update, it included an Article 87 that enabled us to provide technical support on any issue to the European Commission, but also required us to publish this environmental report every 3 years in order to track progress within the industry. Moving on to 2019, at that point, we came to a final conclusion on a huge amount of research that had been performed in terms of trying to measure particulate matter from aircraft engines, which we started back in 2008. There was also a significant amount of rulemaking discussions that led to finally a particulate matter engine emission standard at the ICAO level that was integrated into Volume 2 and subsequently adopted into our basic regulation. And at that point, it was clear from a policymaking perspective that there'd been a significant amount of standard setting work at the ICAO level with a basket of measures that was addressing all aspects of noise, air quality, and climate change. During this year, we also published the second edition of the environmental report, and recognizing that standard setting had been significantly active over the last decade, there was a bit of a shift in focus, now starting to look at how can we support emerging technology, novel energy sources that need to be brought forward in order to address some of the environmental challenges that we were facing. Within the environmental report, we had trouble really getting any kind of data in terms of what was being done in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. And so in this year, we did perform some research and some studies looking at how can we collect that data, get a clear understanding as to what's going on in the sector, and incentivize the SAF sector going forward, because the previous decade really hadn't driven that work forward much. And these studies fed into the work that the Commission subsequently did with regard to Refuel EU, which you'll hear about later, that hopefully will now stimulate the SAF market, which is considered to be a critical element in mitigating emissions for the sector going forward. It was also in 2019 when we had an initial international cooperation project that was very much focused on environment, and this was looking to support the implementation of what had been agreed previously, this CORSIA market-based measures at the global level. So looking to work with partner states to implement that and ensure that no country is left behind. And it's taken forward at a global level in order to address these global environmental challenges that we face. And since 2019, over the last 4 years, there's been a significant uptake in terms of the environmental aspects of international cooperation, recognizing that's a critical way of Europe trying to ensure that it's addressed at a global level across all regions of the world. Towards the end of 2019, there was a key moment in time that has really accelerated the discussion on sustainability and environmental protection within the aviation sector, and that was when the Commission launched the European Green Deal. And within that Green Deal, there's a specific objective to reduce emissions from transport by 90% in 2050 compared to 1990, which we know from the environmental report and the data we collect is a massive challenge for the sector that it has to step up and meet. A lot of the work that had been done up to the point of 2020 had been really focused on CO2 in terms of climate change with the aeroplane CO2 standard, CORSIA. But in 2020, there was a report that the Commission asked the EASA to produce looking at the climate impact of non-CO2 emissions, so NOx, particulate matter, and their subsequent contribution towards persistent contrails, cirrus clouds. So recognizing that this aspect also needed to be addressed, not just CO2, we needed to also address the non-CO2 element from a climate change perspective. That work, that report was published, so it has led to a significant amount of research being taken forward within Horizon Europe, Clean Aviation, CESAR, even at the ICAO level, looking at trying to improve our scientific understanding of that and how we can address it going forward to ensure that we achieve what we want to achieve and it doesn't have unintended consequences. We also saw new technology coming forward this year, and EASA certified the first ever electric aircraft in the Pipistrel Electro. And it was at this point that we created the Sustainable Aviation Program within EASA, recognizing there was a significant amount of activities now, and that needed to try and improve the coordination on a horizontal basis. Building on the European Green Deal, the Commission launched what was called a Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy in 2020, with an action plan of 82 initiatives. And that strategy led to, in 2021, specific legislative proposals being brought forward by the Commission under what was called Fit for 55. This is looking at reducing the emissions in Europe by 55% by 2030. And within the Fit for 55 proposals, there were various things that are expected to have an impact on the aviation sector. This included a revision to the emissions trading system, a revision to the Energy Taxation Directive, a revision to the Renewable Energy Directive, but most importantly, I think, in terms of, from an EASA perspective, the Refuel EU Aviation Initiative to promote the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. So some critical legislative proposals being brought forward all at the same time to try and ensure that the sector's moving in the direction it needs to go. During this year, we also certified the first ever aircraft against the ICAO aeroplane CO2 standard globally, and more configurations are starting to be certified against this. And to further incentivize the work that's needed, the EU also adopted what's called the European Climate Law with an adopted goal of climate neutrality by 2050. In 2022, we issued the third edition of the environmental report, and within that, there's actually recommendations as well, the first time, in terms of it provides information on how is the sector performing from a traffic noise emissions perspective, the mitigation measures that can be done, put in place to address those impacts. And within this report, there was also recommendations on how can we go further to improve the environmental performance. During this year, the ICAO Assembly also adopted a long-term aspirational goal for international aviation, which is net zero CO2 emissions. And that goal really is driving the dialogue now at a global level. How can the aviation sector achieve that goal? There were also revisions to the ETS that were adopted, reducing the emissions cap, SAF allowances to, again, incentivize the use of SAF by airline operators. And so we come to 2023. EASA is taking leadership roles within industry alliances, again trying to support the uptake of new technology, novel energy sources within RCLF and ASEA, so SAF, hydrogen electric. We've also been working to support the integration of new markets by ensuring that we have robust certification requirements that ensures a level playing field, but also a high level of environmental protection for EU citizens. So we've published noise measurement guidelines for drones, UAS, and also environmental protection technical specifications for eVTOL. We've also, just in the last couple of months, launched new projects in terms of a SAF clearinghouse to help new fuel producers coming to the market to approve their fuels through the ASTM process, and also look at fuel standards. How can we improve the qualities of fuel in terms of specifications to mitigate non-CO2 emissions? There's an ICAO conference planned for next month called CAF3 that is looking to update the ICAO vision for SAF by 2050. This is building on the long-term aspirational goal agreed last year, and to put in place a new global framework that will stimulate the uptake of SAF at a global level. At the moment, it's very much focused on Europe and the US. We need it to be a global initiative. We need all states to understand the business opportunities that are available in this area and to kickstart the SAF market on a global basis. There are also revisions to the Renewable Energy Directive that we expect to be adopted. And then finally, we have this Refuel EU aviation regulation to stimulate SAF, where EASA has new remits to monitor the use and supply of SAF, as well as introduce an environmental labeling system, which I will now pass over to Dietmar, who will give you a bit more detail.
Thank you, Steve. So, good afternoon. I'm Dietmar Bloemes, Sustainable Aviation Program Manager, and essentially trying to coordinate what Steve presented as of 2019 until now internally at the agency. And I don't have too many slides left for you anymore, but just to finalize this session, I would like to brief you a bit more in detail about the Refuel EU aviation legislation. So it was adopted last week under the Spanish presidency by the regulators and the European Union. So what is this really about? There's of course the big pressure on the aviation industry. I think my colleague Steve explained a bit the reasons, also the legislative actions that the European Union has taken in terms of the Green Deal. In terms of solutions, how the industry can decarbonize, there are several options. Probably a combination of all those options will be needed to really reach the Green Deal objectives. But it is widely recognized that the use of sustainable aviation fuels is the tool that we have available today. We have already SAF flying. It is certified to a certain percentage of share in the blend, and it is there. So the European legislators also recognize the fact that SAF is really expensive today. So in order to really ramp up the supply of SAF in the Union, a regulatory framework was needed, and this is what we will present here. It's the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation. It really should boost the production of SAF. I think we heard it this morning as well in the presentation. Industry is in need of certainty, and if there is a regulatory framework in place that provides certainty, it always is to the benefit of the industry. And in this case, we can say that because of the high prices, a small regulatory push, let's say, to start producing SAF at certain shares, starting at 2% in 2025 and reaching 70% in 2070, will actually create a certainty to investors, will create a certainty to SAF producers to really ramp up their productions, because they will have the certainty that airlines will take up and will offtake those SAF volumes. At the same time, it also provides a level playing field. The Refuel EU legislation, so boosting the SAF at 2% in 2025 and 70% in 2050, will be applicable to all member states, and there will be also mechanisms in place to ensure that also in the global context, the loss of competition is also monitored and action is taken if this is really affected. So the essence, of course, is to ramp up the SAF supply. The regulation, which will enter into force on the 1st of January 2024, also has a couple of other elements included. One of them is an article that will require the establishment of a label for flights. This builds on work that EASA has performed in the previous years, but essentially it will target consumers to book the most sustainable flights on booking platforms, on platforms of airlines, and it will take into account the amount of SAF being used. So in a way, it is an incentivizing mechanism offered to airlines to show then expected CO2 footprints for flights they offer. And this is going to be an implementing act under the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation, for which EASA will support the Commission as well, and that implementation is foreseen on the 1st of January 2025. In addition to that, the rule is also a bit forward-looking, so it's not only SAF that the rule will target, also elements of hydrogen and electric use will be covered, in the sense that also airports will start to prepare themselves, not only for SAF, but also for what comes next, which is the provision of electricity as well as hydrogen for the moment those technologies become available to the market. And the rule will already start to collect information on the progress airports are making as regards the necessary infrastructure, obviously for SAF, but also for hydrogen and electricity. There will also be some flexibility measures. As I said earlier, it needs to be monitored how the SAF can gradually enter the market, and also it needs to be monitored how that will further affect the airlines' daily operations. So here's an overview of the shares of SAF. So as I said, it will be 2% in 2025, 6% in 2030, and then it grows to 70%. So that means that fuel suppliers have to deliver those shares and percentages of SAF to union airports. And what we mean with SAF, it is defined via the Renewable Energy Directive that Steve was referring to. So it is obviously a sustainable fuel, and it contains biofuels, it contains synthetic aviation fuels, and it also contains recycled carbon fuels, and also low carbon aviation fuels. There has been also created a specific sub-mandate for the synthetic aviation fuels. Again, the legislators have argued here that it is even more expensive than, let's say, the biofuels, but it has the highest decarbonization element. So that's why there is a sub-target of 1.2% in 2030, growing to 35% for synthetic aviation fuels, so not of bio origin, and generated by hydrogen and in combination with CO2. So the scope and the obligations of the regulation will essentially target three stakeholders. And the fourth one would be member states, and of course the Commission and EASA as well. We also have our role, and I will come back to that on the next slide. So aviation suppliers will have the mandate to supply the fuels at the union airports. There will be some flexibility measures in order not to push them to provide it at each union airport. They can use an average. So as long as on average they deliver 2% in 2025 SAF at EU airports, they comply. Union airports will have the obligation to facilitate access to SAF for airlines. Of course, the regulation targets, let's say, mostly the commercial transport, and if you look at airports, it will also target those airports which have a significant volume of freight or passengers. However, there will be an opt-in, and this is, of course, interesting for other sectors in the aviation business, business jets, even rotorcraft can sort of benefit in the sort of opt-in scenario from this regulation as well. The same is then true for the aircraft operators. Again, it targets a certain size of operators, where then the opt-in for certain other commercial flights and even non-commercial flights. And the operators, they don't have a mandate to take up SAF, but they have a mandate to take up fuel at a rate of 90% what they need for that flight. And this is the so-called tankering provision. Because otherwise, if they may have a situation where they would tank cheap fuel outside of the European Union, and in order to prevent that scenario, which is typically referred to as carbon leakage, the regulators have addressed the so-called tankering regulation in it as well. So what does it mean for EASA? EASA has been giving a very central role here, in the sense that we will have to collect a lot of information and then analyze that information so that appropriate action can be taken. So we will produce a yearly report starting in 2025. What we will do is collect the information from the operators on their SAF usage, but also the characteristics of the various types of SAF they use. As I said, also on the tankering provisions, we will monitor their fuel usage. On the fuel supplier side, we will get access to the volumes of SAF, as well as the fossil fuels they deliver at union airports. We will also monitor the levels of aromatics, naphthalene and sulfur in the fossil fuel component, because this is an element that really affects the non-CO2 emission behavior, as Steve explained, and also their action may need to be taken in future. We collect information from the airports as regards their infrastructure development on hydrogen and electricity, as I explained. But we will also do market analysis of SAF prices, fossil fuel prices. We will do a full price analysis because that information will be used as a penalty system for member states to determine non-compliance. The non-compliance will be leading to a penalty that airlines or fuel producers have to pay, and that will be based on the price analysis information that the agency will publish on a yearly basis. It will also determine the number of free SAF allowances that airlines can use under their emission trading system compliance. And therefore, in general terms, we will collect information that allows a regulatory compliance status. We will inform member states about potential non-compliances of stakeholders, and we will make that report available to the Parliament and the Council so that they can review the adequateness of the regulation. Then we have a couple of supporting measures that the EASA is responsible for on SAF, but not related to the regulation. However, they are seen as flanking, supporting measures, again, to boost up the use of SAF. The EU Clearinghouse, as Steve has explained, is together with the Fuel Standards Project, two projects that really will help industry to get their SAF types approved in a more efficient way. At the same time, we are involved in the RLCF Alliance. That alliance brings together the stakeholders of the value chain, and again, regulations is a potential barrier that prevents more uptake of SAF, and for that reason, EASA is involved in this alliance as well. It's an alliance that is managed by the European Commission. And last but not least, we will see probably an uptake of SAF as per the regulation, 2% going to 70%. There will be more types of SAF approved in accordance with ASTM entering the fleet, and as such, EASA also has started to further increase its technical expertise internally with additional SAF experts that will be ready then to monitor, let's say, the safe operations, both on initial as well as continuing airworthiness side of the various types of SAF that will enter the market. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Colin.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dietmar. We're actually out of time and there are no questions currently on Slido, so we'll move directly to the next panel. But I would say if anybody has any questions, if they pop up in Slido, then we will invite an answer from Steve and Dietmar. So thank you very much.